An excellent way to develop demand and supply theory is to start thinking about the areas of surplus. Now, surplus becomes a really important concept, particularly next year in year 2, but it's a really effective way of getting some good analysis marks in evaluation marks as well in your essays in the end of paper 1 as well. So when we're talking about surplus, we are essentially showing the extent of benefit on a diagram. So it's a good visual way of showing how much consumers and producers benefit from a transaction. So I'm going to look at them separately. In theory, you can show them on the same diagram, but just to make it a little bit simpler, we're going to look at consumer surplus here on the left, and we're going to look at producer surplus here on the right. So let's start with some definitions then. Consumer surplus is the difference between the amount that consumers are willing and able to pay and the market price which they actually pay. So if we think about this in terms of a kind of a real world example, let's imagine we're talking about the next Harry Potter book to come out or something like that. Now, we know that this demand curve here essentially represents the amount that consumers are willing to pay. And we've basically, you can imagine, we've lined everybody up in order from those people who are willing to pay the very highest amount, who are these ones up here, all the way along, and then these ones down here are the ones who are willing to pay less in order to get their hands on that Harry Potter book. So what that means is that these first few people up here, they are willing to pay a really high price, a very high price, in order to get their hands on the Harry Potter book. You know, let's say perhaps that these people up here, they would be willing to pay £40 in order to get that Harry Potter book. But of course they don't actually have to pay £40 because the market price, as we can see here, the equilibrium market price down here is much lower than that. So the equilibrium market price, let's say if we're talking about the full kind of hardback book and all the rest of it, is going to be £20. What does that mean? Well, it means that these people would be willing and able to pay 40. They don't, they only have to pay 20. Now the difference between those two amounts is what we call the consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus for these very early purchases of the Harry Potter books, the ones who have the highest willingness and ability to pay, is going to be £20. So they are going to have consumer surplus equal to the entire amount of that. Now, we've also got some people who would be willing to pay somewhere between £20 and £40. So we would also have people who would be willing to pay £30 in order to get the book. These are the people out to here. Now, they don't get quite as much surplus as the first people did, but they still get this amount of surplus here. And similarly, we then have some people who would be willing to pay £25. So they get a little bit more surplus like that. And when we add up all of these bits of surplus for all of the consumers, we essentially end up shading in this triangle here. So this triangular area here is how we show consumer surplus on a diagram. So the consumer surplus is the difference between the amount that consumers are willing and able to pay, which obviously is shown by the position of the demand curve, and the market price which they actually do pay. Now, if we switch over to the right-hand side here, think about the same sort of situation from the producer's point of view. So if we have a situation where, again, our price here is £20. Okay. Now, it's certainly the case that there will be some suppliers who are willing to supply the good for a great deal less than that. You know, they will be the most efficient suppliers. They will have the lowest level of costs and so on. They would be willing to supply this product for, let's say, £5 down here, which means, again, what we have here. We'll use a different colour just so we're clear. We'll take blue. So the producers, these early producers, they get £15 of producer surplus. Okay. Now, if we think about the producers who are kind of in the middle as well, we're going to have some producers with slightly higher costs than those early ones. They would benefit from £10 of surplus, and then we're going to have some more suppliers as well they are going to have slightly higher costs again. So they would be willing to sell for £15, but they don't. They get 20. So they get £5 of surplus. And again, as you can see here, what we're doing is we are creating a shaded area underneath the line like this, underneath the market price. So what we end up with then is a situation where we know that in a free market we will end up with Q amount of the good being bought and sold, and we know that in that amount there will be some consumers who are getting extra benefit that they're not having to pay for. They are benefiting from the consumer surplus, and equally there will be the more efficient producers who are getting extra benefit as well. So we refer to that as the producer surplus, and they're shown by these triangular areas here. Now, one other thing that I just want to show very quickly is how a change in the market price will affect these relative amounts of surplus. So we're going to use another pair of diagrams here to think about what the effect of a price change is on consumer surplus and producer surplus. So on the diagram on the left here, I've got a shift to the left of supply, and I've also marked on in green the original amount of consumer surplus which was generated in this market from the previous equilibrium. Now, when supply shifts to the left, that obviously generates a new equilibrium for us at this point here, and that means that we end up with a higher price and a lower quantity than we did before. But how does that actually affect the amount of consumer surplus, the amount of extra benefit for consumers? Well, if we think about the definition, remember the definition is it's the difference between the amount that consumers are willing and able to pay, and we're told that by the position of the demand curve, and the amount that they actually pay, which is the market price. Now, the willingness and ability hasn't actually changed here, the demand curve hasn't moved, but the price has. So now, the new area of consumer surplus is only this area on top here. So the area of consumer surplus has become smaller. And what we can say is that the area of consumer surplus which has been lost is this area underneath here. So if we just think about how we would label this, so this area up here, the area on top of the line, this is the remaining consumer surplus, and this shaded area here is the consumer surplus which is lost as a result of this higher price. And if we think about a similar sort of situation for the diagram on the right here, where we're thinking about the producer surplus, we've got the original producer surplus area, which is the blue triangle. But what were to happen if demand for this product were to increase? Well, that would mean that the firms now receive a higher price for their products, which means they are obviously going to benefit from a higher level of surplus. And again, we can show that on the diagram, because in addition now to that blue area, they are also going to get this extra kind of pink-red area on top. So this area here is the amount of producer surplus which is gained as a result of the increase in price from the higher level of demand. And it's a really useful way to analyse the impact of price change on consumers and firms, to use the idea of surplus, because surplus is essentially showing us the extra level of welfare, the extra level of utility that that doesn't need to be paid for. So it's a good representation of the amount of benefit that consumers and producers are gaining from the market.